Oh, hell, Internet! So here we are then. This is the last of the essays in Between Past and Future, and it's now over 3 years since I began with the Crisis in Education, which at the time was a one-off video. It has been a journey, and I am definitely more educated on Arendt now, although, as always, I am still not a scholar by any means. This was, in my opinion, the most conceptually difficult of all the essays in the anthology, and as ever, there were several places where I am uncertain if I have interpreted Arendt correctly. Sometimes I have called this out, sometimes I didn't want to restate it, and doubtless sometimes I didn't even notice. Coming to this essay last, though, with the benefit of hindsight, freedom, or perhaps the expression of it, seems to be arguably at the root of everything this anthology is grasping at. These 8 essays drove Arendt in her later work, which is why Between Past and Future is often considered such an important part of her corpus. It is the preparatory set of questions, or exercises in thinking, that would underpin the human condition some years later. There are 4 parts to this essay, which I will name as Part 1, The Paradox of Freedom, Part 2, Political Action as Freedom, Part 3, The Problem of the Will, and finally Part 4, The Miracle of Freedom. The first thing that Arendt does is to point out the tension that exists between politics, or ethics, and science, or causality. She sums it up as the difference between our conscience and consciousness telling us we are free and hence responsible, and our everyday experience in the outer world in which we act according to the principle of causality. This is restating the problem of free will, and Arendt will go on to explain how free will and political freedom are not the same thing. But the problem shows that the assumption of human freedom, which comes so naturally to us in almost every social and political context, becomes more uncertain the more theoretical and scientific that we get, and freedom itself seems to become a mirage once psychology deeply probes the roots of human motivation. The layman's defense to this problem is to claim that freedom is found in the practical intractability of the complex world we live in, and this is suitable for all humans in their everyday lives, but it is unfortunately not a serious philosophical defense, as it does not demonstrate freedom, only ignorance of possible constraints. And that's fine. Arendt highlights Kant's project, which is the seminal modern attempt to formalize the metaphysical process, and her extrapolation of the relevant insights goes roughly thus. Freedom is not directly perceived internally any more than it is externally. Causality, whether or not it is real, does, as a mental phenomenon, form an ordering principle for everything we look at in the phenomenal world. Therefore, this question of practical freedom or agency against theoretical non-freedom or causality is something pre-theoretical and therefore prior to both the science and the ethics in which we claim to see it manifested. With this in mind, then, it is thought itself which makes freedom disappear and then necessitates Kant's solution to the problem. And what was that solution, I hear you ask? Kant saved freedom from this twofold assault upon it by distinguishing between a pure or theoretical reason and a practical reason whose centre is free will, whereby it is important to keep in mind that the free-willing agent, who is practically all-important, never appears in the phenomenal world, neither in the outer world of our 5 senses, nor in the field of the inner sense with which I sense myself. But this does little to eliminate the greatest and most dangerous difficulty, namely that thought itself in its theoretical as well as its pre-theoretical form makes freedom disappear. I will be honest, I don't think I have, with my vaguest understanding of Kant, enough to follow her thought process clearly here, but that is a me problem. She's referring to the outcome of Kant's 3 critiques, and she claims that the concept of political freedom is not like Kantian free will. She will highlight Montesquieu's use of the term later, but political freedom is something we have in our life as an individual in a world of other individuals. We shall see this again just below and uncover more in part 3, but but I would hazard that her solution here is not going to convince everyone, and we get a taste of this just after. To the question of politics, the problem of freedom is crucial, and this problem has led into the obscure wood wherein philosophy has lost its way. It is the contention of the following considerations that the reason for this obscurity is that the phenomenon of freedom does not appear in the realm of thought at all, that neither freedom nor its opposite is experienced in the dialogue between me and myself, in the course of which the great philosophical and metaphysical questions arise, and that the Western philosophical tradition is failing to appreciate this and has distorted, instead of clarifying, the very idea of freedom by transposing it from its original field, the realm of politics and human affairs in general, to an inward domain, the will. Taking that quote alone, it feels like a radically secularizing political statement, which Arendt has certainly made in the past. Political freedom can never emerge from our contemplation, but must come from action. The first defense of this view is that freedom is among the last of the great philosophical questions to be raised, and that those who raised it, most notably for Arendt, Paul and Augustine, did so in the context of having a religious conversion, a radical inner shift of inner motivation, which may appear to be pre-causal, an effect of the will. Whether or not this is true, the transcendental tone of these experiences has been transposed from the discussion of free will to the political idea of freedom, where Arendt says it has no place. Along with this example, Arendt cites Epictetus, who was born a slave and was writing in the very oppressive period of the late Roman Empire, which she says is significant. Epictetus still has, she claims, the most persuasive argument for the absolute superiority of inner freedom. And his concept of freedom was likewise in the sense of a command that man has over himself, and claims that it is more fundamental than the outer freedom of the world of men. Now, I could simply say here that Arendt ultimately disagrees with Epictetus and concludes that the inner freedom he's talking of is derivative of political freedom, because all attempts to establish it eventually fell back on a retreat from conditions in the material world, specifically because political freedom was prevented from manifesting. Whew. We do need to keep moving, but over the course of one page introducing this conclusion, Arendt states that mankind is defined as a being capable of action, which is a core maxim of her later work. She states that an assumption of freedom is necessary for either action or politics to be treated seriously. She makes the related but distinct claim that freedom is the only reason that people choose to live together in political organization at all, and she insists that the inner space where freedom appears must be distinct from either the heart or the mind, both of which function explicitly in interaction with the world and so cannot be free of both motive and causation. Of these claims, I will stop to look at just one, the idea that freedom is the reason that men choose to live together in political organization at all. This is a big claim, and I don't feel she fully justifies it here, but it feels like a kind of negative space argument. I'm sure there's a formal name for that, by which I mean that action and politics must depend on something to become coherent in the world as we see them, and this thing is what Arendt is terming to be freedom. She supports this by saying that we have always experienced freedom as a simple fact of everyday political life, and this does feel intuitively powerful, but on the other hand, it also smells a bit like begging the question, so I'm just going to note that and move on for now. We proceed then with the assumption that we only know inner freedom or free will because we have experienced outer freedom in the world, which may then have been curtailed. Worldly freedom requires some kind of liberation. The most fundamental kind of liberation is from the necessities of life, food, shelter, etc. And this is our first explicit connection to the previous essay on the related subject of authority. However, Arendt goes on to say that mere liberation is not enough. Political freedom requires the necessary presence of other humans to associate with, and a public realm to interact with. Now, this is very important. This is not because of the brute fact of having someone to be free from, but mainly due to the nature of action, which she will explore in part 2. And don't worry, I'll mention it at the time because it has implications for everybody. But this is the root of the deep interconnectedness of freedom with the realm of politics that she will end up endorsing. Now, we have to mention that Arendt paints with a rather broad brush in excluding tribal societies, barbarian empires, and the household from her notion of the political, but her process in drawing the line between political and pre-political seems to rest on this quote. Without a politically guaranteed public realm, freedom lacks the worldly space to make its appearance. To be sure, it may dwell in men's hearts, but the human heart is a very dark place, and whatever goes on in its obscurity can hardly be called a demonstrable fact. Freedom as a demonstrable fact and politics coincide and are related to each other like two sides of the same matter. This is all related to the creation of a world in the Arendtian sense, a sustained aggregation of human artifice. In the Western tradition, Arendt has elected to draw this line, not unreasonably, at the Greek polis, but this is obviously based on things like her appraisal of the lighting conditions of the human heart. Immediately after this, though, she throws a spanner into her own works. It is precisely this coincidence of politics and freedom which we cannot take for granted in the light of our present political experience. The rise of totalitarianism, its claim to having subordinated all spheres of life to the demands of politics, and its consistent non-recognition of civil rights, above all the right of privacy and the right to freedom from politics, makes us doubt not only the coincidence of politics and freedom, but their very compatibility. So, yeah, Arendt pretty much asks us to question the basis of everything she has just been saying, at least in modern terms, when she says that this new tendency for the political to subsume other spheres of life puts it at odds with freedom. For Arendt, totalitarianism is an entirely new type of government, but it is really just the climax of centuries of growing distance between freedom and the political, leading her to ask, was not the liberal credo, the less politics, the more freedom, right after all? Is it not true that politics is compatible with freedom only because and insofar as it guarantees a possible freedom from politics? This concept is reminiscent of the original anti-political attitudes of the Socratic school and the early Christians, which does lead to the problem of the will in part 3. But this final separation really began in the 17th century, when the purpose of government began to be equated with the protection of a space where political activities could occur, and the emergence of the political and social sciences led to this being reinterpreted as a more abstract security of the life process as a whole. Government, which since the beginning of the modern age had been identified with the total domain of the political, was now considered to be the appointed protector not so much of freedom as of the life process and the interests of society and its individuals. Not the individual's security against violent death, but a security which should permit an undisturbed development of the life process of society as a whole. This life process is not bound up with freedom, but follows its own inherent necessity, and it can be called free only in the sense that we speak of a freely flowing stream. As human culture has expanded, such abstractions do become unavoidable, but they necessarily alter the relationship between the individual and society, and they do not express the political freedom that was part of the Greek polis. There's no doubt that this can be dehumanizing, and I have a sneaking suspicion that this recentering upon the life process as a whole is at the root of some of the distrust of government which exists today, and this is part of the crises of modernity. But this risk and the risk of totalitarian takeover is not limited to either a liberal or a conservative worldview, although, let me be clear, I am quite certain which side is more enamored with totalitarianism as of 2025. Most people will function with any status quo that enables their own definition of freedom. Although the term status quo has become something of a political pejorative, we must remember that it also represents political stability, which is generally assumed to be a good thing. So the task of government could be reinterpreted as dehumanizing people no more than they personally consider to be onerous, and simultaneously doing this for the whole population, of course. But this still creates a tension between the needs of the rulers and the ruled, especially as the population grows larger, and this is not a static relationship either. Over time, the ideological drift will get worse, and there will be an eventual breakdown of trust, which is the true threat to any system of government. It was not out of a desire for freedom that people eventually demanded their share in government or admission to the political realm, but out of a mistrust in those who held power over their life and goods. At the end of part 1, Arendt makes another clear connection to the essay on authority, noting that Christianity in its early days eschewed the public realm and demanded a similar freedom from politics, and that they were preceded in this by the philosophers of the Platonic tradition, who saw that it was necessary to abstain from politics in order to obtain the highest and freest way of life, the vita contemplativa. And Arendt closes with a statement of her purpose and a return to the union of freedom and politics that she just asked us to question. Despite the enormous weight of this tradition, and despite the perhaps even more telling urgency of our own experiences, both pressing into the same direction of a divorce of freedom from politics, I think the reader may still believe he has read only an old truism when I say that the raison d'etre of politics is freedom, and that this freedom is primarily experienced in action. In the following, I shall do no more than reflect on this old truism. She does not categorically say that she agrees with this truism, although it does seem almost implied by her earlier suggestion that freedom is an everyday experience in the political realm, but by the end of the essay she will have endorsed this position. Before we move on to part 2, we need to take a little sidebar on action and its part in the vita activa as opposed to the vita contemplativa. This has come up before over the course of the series, so you may want to skip this short section, but let me just introduce it for anyone who hasn't watched the earlier essays. From her investigations of the Western tradition and mirroring Aristotle somewhat, Arendt suggests that there are two completely different types of lives that are available to humans, and that they are, to an extent at least, mutually exclusive. Aristotle termed them the bios politikos and the bios theoretikos, and Arendt speaks of the subtly different vita activa and vita contemplativa. Arendt extensively investigated the vita activa in the human condition, and she was intending to expand her model of the vita contemplativa in the life of the mind, but this was never finished before her death. The vita activa consists of 3 levels. First, labour, the mechanical business of sustaining the life process, e.g. finding food, creating shelter, and so on. In labour, every individual is almost entirely interchangeable, being equally capable to perform the function of finding food, subject only to inherent physical ability. Labour is consistently represented as the lowest level, and Arendt does imply that there is something base about it, even referring to animal laborans rather than homo laborans, as she does with the higher levels. But I think it would be a great mistake to think that she is simply writing this off as something to be transcended. This is the realm that is closest to the life process. The realm of labour is literally the most vital. The second layer is work, the ability to build and maintain a world. All kinds of crafts fall into this category, where, despite obvious skill, the agent always remains subordinate to the product as they are guided by design, and thus ideologically and often physically outlasted by their work. Platonic models loom heavily over the realm of work, and it is here that the vita contemplativa imposes on the vita activa. I think of the realm of work as the realm of control, where human minds impose patterns on reality. This is the Taoist aspect of yang made manifest. As for its opposite, just a moment. The third level of the vita activa is action, the moment of actualization where we identify ourselves to the world through the novelty we create. This is supposed to be entirely where political life consists, and even though the state is supposed to outlive us, it must be constantly regulated by action, and we'll see why in part 2. But this is why all political metaphors from craft analogies are imperfect, as Plato discovered to his chagrin. In our action, we answer the question, who are you? We disclose ourselves in deeds and words, and Arendt does give special significance to speech as a class of action. Action is the highest level of the vita activa, but there is a sense also in which that is to its detriment. It exists at a level much more abstract than much of what makes the human world function. So how can it be said to represent the human world at all? Before we get to that, we also need to recognize that our action is not always fully under our control. The kind of identity that we think we reveal to the world when we act is not always the identity which is perceived. This leads Arendt to narrative as crucial for interpreting action, and so we see how tradition and religion have come to be laid down as a community of memory. This is all well and good for action as the augmenter of tradition, but how does the individual contextualize their own actions and the actions of others? The nature of action is to be unpredictable in outcome and interpretation, and also irreversible, because where work and labour can both be started anew, actions can never be undone. We try to mitigate the first problem by our ability to promise, thus binding agents into an attempt to fix some future outcome. And we try to mitigate the latter problem through our ability to forgive, enabling the careless actor to find atonement and move beyond the transgression that led to some past outcome. There is a final aspect to the model here though. Labour is at the bottom of the vita activa, closest to the life process. Action is at the top, somehow embodying the essence of natality. But they are separated by the realm of work and fabrication. And as we discussed before, fabrication is where the craft analogies of Plato are truly appropriate. But they have also always necessarily included the element of violence done to the raw materials. This is the structure of the vita activa, and when I looked at the crisis in culture, I arranged this schematic of the vita activa and its purpose, at least as I understand them, commented below. Within that system, Arendt describes the thing which is at the highest point of our culture, which we often call the beautiful or perhaps the good, and we acknowledge that there seems to be a need, almost a drive, to somehow relate this back to the life process without the controlling influence of fabrication. Something that we can just accept as a comforting way to assure ourselves that the life process is still secure, something to surrender to, a reconnecting of the beautiful back to life, a relegare. Freedom as related to politics is not a phenomenon of the will, rather it is the freedom to call something into being which did not exist before. Political freedom is not the freedom we may or may not have in our own will, rather it is the ability to execute free action. Action is not always free, it can be influenced by both the will and the intellect, but it is free to the extent that it is able to transcend them. There is a certain contradictory tone here, to be sure. Action both requires interaction with the intellect and will, and requires independence from them. How does Arendt tackle this? Action, insofar as it is determined, is guided by a future aim whose desirability the intellect has grasped before the will wills it, whereby the intellect calls upon the will, since only the will can dictate action. Action, insofar as it is free, is neither under the guidance of the intellect nor under the dictate of the will, although it needs both for the execution of any particular goal, but springs forth from something altogether different which I will call a principle. So what is a principle? This is again quite Kantian, I think, and it seems, emphasis on seems, quite straightforward. Principles are such broad concepts as honour, glory, love of equality, but also fear, distrust, or hatred. They are external to the self, i.e. not a product of the will, and they are universal to humanity, i.e. they are not a function of any one individual's personal goals. The difficulty comes when we ask how to relate these to action. According to Arendt, the manifestation of a principle comes about only through action. They are manifest in the world as long as the action lasts, but no longer. Freedom, or its opposite, appears in the world whenever such principles are actualized. So, freedom is not something that we have inherently, but something that we express only through our principled action, and then only while we act. To say that this definition lacks clarity is probably an understatement. Principles can manifest freedom or its opposite? And how does the principle inspire action again, especially independently of the will and the intellect? Even if we grant the mechanism, can we demonstrate it? Although we get into more detail in part 3, Arendt does not fully resolve this issue here, but she does at least have a better metaphor to show what she means, coming from her best 15th century boy, Machiavelli. Freedom as inherent in action is perhaps best illustrated by Machiavelli's concept of virtù, the excellence with which man answers the opportunities the world opens up before him in the guise of fortuna. In chapter 25 of The Prince, Machiavelli considers the idea of fortune and how humans can best respond to it. The last short paragraph of the chapter employs a rather dated metaphor, but I encourage you to look past that, however it first strikes you, and focus on its purpose. Arendt's subsequent move will suggest a softer reinterpretation. I hold strongly to this, that it is better to be impetuous than circumspect, because fortune is a woman, and if she is to be submissive, it is necessary to beat and coerce her. She is more often subdued by men who do this than by those who act coldly. She favours young men because they are less circumspect and more ardent, and because they command her with greater audacity. The impetuousness that Machiavelli speaks of is nothing less than the ability to respond to fortuna in the world in real time. This is the virtù, and Arendt solidifies her metaphor for action around another similar word, virtuosity. Excellence in virtù can be compared to the performing arts. A virtuoso demonstrates their status simply by the performance itself, not by any product which emerges from it and outlasts it, as in the creative arts. The virtuoso does have skill and the benefits of training, but there is a spontaneity to the performance which perhaps precludes both cognition and will. All that remains is action. This immediacy draws a crucial distinction between the craftsman and the performer. The craftsman can certainly be free to act in the creative process, but their freedom is never witnessed by the audience, who only ever perceive the finished product, which does not express freedom. Arendt never makes this claim, but it feels like her trying to resolve the problem of violence in Plato's craft analogies. Since all acting contains an element of virtuosity, and because virtuosity is an excellence we ascribe to the performing arts, politics has often been defined as an art. This is not a definition, but a metaphor, and the metaphor becomes completely false if one falls into the common error of regarding the state or government as a work of art. And, having avoided this error, we are compelled to conclude that political institutions, no matter how well or badly designed, depend for continued existence upon acting men. Independent existence marks the work of art as a product of making. Utter dependence upon further acts to keep it in existence marks the state as a product of action. If politics is an art, then this art can only be expressed as a performing art in the actions of the free individuals who conduct it. To regard the state as the product of a creative art would lead directly to Marx's error, which we discussed in the concept of history. If the state is a product of work, then it can be finished, an assertion which is absurd on its face, although no more so than the conservative position that it was perfect already at some time in the past. All this indicates that politics must be a process, not a product, and Arendt completes the metaphor with the following line. Performing artists need an audience to show their virtuosity, just as acting men need the presence of others. Both need a publicly organised space for their work. And I just want to reiterate here that this ability to appear in a public space is where action links freedom and politics, as opposed to the naive idea we saw in part 1 that action somehow expresses a freedom from other people. In Arendtian terms, a human life that renounces plurality is almost incoherent as an idea. With her metaphor from virtuosity established, Arendt suggests again, not for the first time of course, that there is no way to interpret the idea of a political realm without reference to the Greek and Roman eras, and she claims this is because it was during those eras that the political realm achieved its highest esteem. In spite of her endless hero worship of Greek and Roman antiquity, this does make some sense, because of the crystallization of the idea of the polis during that period. and I would speculate that politics was most respected at this time because this was the period where men were most confident that politics could and would eventually resolve human disharmony, even if it hadn't quite yet. Since that time, though, man's faith in politics to bring peace and security has only diminished, and prior to that time there was, at least according to Arendt, no political sphere to speak of. If then we understand the political in the sense of the polis, its end or raison d'etre would be to establish and preserve a space where freedom as virtuosity can appear. Whatever occurs in this space of appearances is political by definition. What remains outside it, such as the great feats of barbarian empires, may be impressive and noteworthy, but it is not political, strictly speaking. Arendt chooses to draw this bright line between political and non-political, but the reality must be a grey area, and it seems ridiculous to suggest that there was absolutely no political realm implied in, say, the Code of Hammurabi or the Egyptian civilization over 1,000 years earlier. That said, again, considering the concept of the polis, you can see her logic in drawing the line where she does. This Greek and Roman influence, Arendt says, is more of a Socratic and Augustinian influence, and she says that we struggle to find a satisfying political basis for freedom exactly because we tend to assign freedom to an attribute of the will and of thought, rather than action. Her metaphor from virtuosity is part of her case that this assumption is flawed, and a second reason for this confusion is the belief that somehow perfect liberty is incompatible with the existence of society, which comes from John Stuart Mill. This belief seems to be the philosophical expression of the freedom from rather than freedom to argument that denies plurality. However, as this was being expressed by a liberal, Mill needed to temper this conclusion, and Arendt says that he did this by implying that thought itself is not inherently dangerous, but it is some actions that need to be restrained, once again handing priority back over to the realm of will and cognition. This, of course, belongs among the fundamental tenets of liberalism, which, its name notwithstanding, has done its share to banish the notion of liberty from the political realm. Sick burn. But why does she say this? It is because of the conceptual shift we mentioned above. As the scope of human civilization has become ever greater, the purpose of politics necessarily went from basic security of the city and its citizens to a concern with the life process itself and things that are relevant to it. But this means, where life is at stake, all action is by definition under the sway of necessity, and the proper realm to take care of life's necessities is the gigantic and still increasing sphere of the social and economic life, whose administration has overshadowed the political realm ever since the beginning of the modern age. She says that only foreign affairs remain sufficiently different that they cannot be reduced to social and economic factors, and so are exclusively political, but considers that even this region is now being infringed. And remember, Arendt was writing in the earliest days of what we might call the international community. Her words to us now may sound almost prophetic. It is not fully explored here, but this also underscores how modern liberal politics can be seen as hostile to everyday experiences of freedom. In the quote above, Arendt makes it clear that the social and economic sphere is a sphere of necessity, and the realm of necessity is the realm of labour. It would take us too far afield to show how that statement impacts the economic and especially the social issues that we are seeing in Western democracies today, but I suspect that a full Arendtian treatment of this area would yield a very interesting set of outcomes that would prove edifying and uncomfortable to advocates of both right-wing and left-wing ideologies. The final paragraph of this section introduces for the first and only time the word courage. This may seem to be something of a non sequitur, and it kind of is, but it does make sense if we refer back to the concept of history, where the idea of greatness was expressed as being something that had contempt for life inasmuch as it tried to transcend it. And all of this is in the service of the world and the space of remembrance that offers immortality to mortal humans. And as much as we might want to prevent the fall of every sparrow, it is a lamentable fact that this world of ours, because it existed before us and is meant to outlast our lives in it, simply cannot afford to give primary concern to individual lives and the interests connected with them. There is, without question, a certain amount of bureaucratic callousness baked into that assertion, but it does not follow that we should become desensitized to that at all.
Haha, I've just noticed in the editing the literal contradiction between the idea of bureaucratic callousness being necessary and my idea that we shouldn't be desensitized to that, when a callous literally is something that's desensitized. I'm not going to go into it too much here, but of course you could probably wax lyrical about the difference between desensitization of the callous and desensitization to the existence of the callous and blah 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 de blah. But let's carry on with that said.
However, this is why courage has come up at this point. Courage is not simple temerity or daring. Courage is a conviction to take action, to stand in some sense for the world, even against life, to appear in the public space at all. Courage is indispensable because in politics, not life, but the world is at stake. This draws the bright line between the political, worldly aspects of human existence and life more broadly, and it marks courage out as a specifically political virtue. With all of that said though, courage does kind of come out of nowhere at the end there, and it's just one of the things that hangs together somewhat tenuously in this section. The idea of principles is introduced in a way that implies that their functionality is clear, which may tie into Kant again to be fair, but really they're just a range of abstract nouns, and these become manifest only when they motivate action and only as long as the action lasts, action which is, in the moment, free of the will and the intellect. This is all intuitively appealing, of course, but not at all quantified, and arguably not quantifiable. At its worst, it suggests a kind of airheaded spontaneity that would lead to death by misadventure within a week. Maybe that's a bit harsh, but it does speak to a bit of a problem that Arendt has here. Much like her best 17th and 18th century boys Hobbes and Kant, Arendt tries to create a narrative of the political landscape in which the core concepts can be viewed as fundamental political entities, which interact with the predictable effects of physical quantities. In the Leviathan, Hobbes often, although not always, indicated these technical terms with capital letters, but he, like Arendt here, did not have an objective way to show how precise his system of terms really was. To say it another way, political science isn't scientific, and maybe never can be. To conclude then, Arendt's model is speculative, but only in exactly the same way that every other person's conception of politics is, to a degree, speculative. What we're looking at is the space of political uncertainty which exists where the necessary ambiguities of plurality cause everybody's objective political truth to just break down. And on a personal note for me, this is precisely where monotheistic exceptionalism becomes explicitly evil. At the point where it refuses to admit that it is no more coherent than other more pluralistic philosophies. Part 3 opens with a familiar refrain. Obviously, this notion of an interdependence of freedom and politics stands in contradiction to the social theories of the modern age. Unfortunately, it does not follow that we need only to revert to older pre-modern traditions and theories. I.e., the modern age is incompatible with something we've traditionally found important, but we can't just go back. We saw in the last section a growing conflict between the idea of freedom and the idea of government, and also Arendt's insistence that both depended on the plurality of humankind. She will conclude this section by coming back to why this conflict should be resolved, but first she wants to examine what has led us to this place. Our philosophical and religious institutions have been able to adjust to these new realities, but that does not mean that they are suited to it. Neither philosophical freedom as it first arose in late antiquity, a phenomenon of thought by which man could reason himself out of the world, nor the Christian and modern notion of free will has any ground in political experience. That is, philosophical and religious freedom never occurred between individuals at all, and so it almost presupposes a separation of freedom from politics, which is to call a foul in tennis when you're watching a football game. Arendt identifies the project of Socrates with cognition, or the intellect, and the project of Augustine with the will, neither of which, we discussed above, are pertinent to true action, and so cannot be identified with political freedom. Yet this dual tradition led to the conflation of freedom with free will, a will which was actually not known to the Greeks and Romans. For the history of the problem of freedom, Christian tradition has become the decisive factor, because of the equation of freedom with free will. But will, as Christianity discovered it, had so little in common with the well-known capacities to desire, to intend, and to aim at, that it claimed attention only after it had come into conflict with them. There was no political need for free will in antiquity because the idea of freedom was inherently political, and the status of free men who had conquered necessity was self-evident. The great tradition, rooted in Parmenides and Plato, leading on into Christianity, came to dominate the political scene, but as we saw in previous essays, this tradition was founded explicitly in opposition to the polis. This was the whole Platonic crisis of philosophy. Plato, traumatized by the death of Socrates, turned philosophy away from the political realm. But the great irony is that that same tradition led us both to the theology of medieval Europe and the science of the modern era, and the great tragedy was that theological structure inherited political power. And just to be clear, I would regard it as equally tragic if we were to accept unrestrained scientism, a view which is shared by all actual scientists, I might add. This tradition is led by the bios theoretikos, the vita contemplativa, and is understood as opposing the bios politikos, the vita activa. And it was in this context that, when the early Christians discovered a kind of freedom which had no relation to politics, the concept of freedom entered the history of philosophy. Freedom became one of the chief problems of philosophy when it was experienced as something occurring in the intercourse between me and myself, and outside of the intercourse between men. Free will and freedom became synonymous notions, and the presence of freedom was experienced in complete solitude, where no man might hinder the hot contention wherein I had engaged with myself, the deadly conflict which took place in the inner dwelling of the soul and the dark chamber of the heart. The last part of that quote is paraphrased from Augustine. Need it be mentioned, of course, that Christianity's massive guilt problem has been a troublesome influence throughout, and oh my god if Augustine isn't just a poster boy for that. But the philosophical crux is the inner contention, which Arendt says that the ancients were unaware of. But how can this possibly be true? This is quite subtle, and I may have misunderstood, let me know in the comments, but classical antiquity, which primarily centres on the big three, Socrates, Plato and Aristotle, insisted that human action will always be driven by the intellect, or knowledge, or the two in combination somehow, which then recommends action to the will. Therefore, any person who acts against what is good simply lacks awareness. The concept of a conflict within the will itself, the so-called I will and yet cannot, was simply unknown to them. However, what antiquity was aware of is solitude, and solitude makes a single man no longer one, but two in one. This is the dialectic of thought. Any person who is alone with themselves, and not in some kind of meditative state, is engaged in this dialectic. This does not require a verbal inner monologue. It does not even technically need a response to that which is asserted internally. But this inner dualism is the existential condition of thought. But classical antiquity was also grounded on a Platonic dualism of soul and body, and in championing the vita contemplativa, Plato insisted that the soul must rule over the body and give it motion, despite this hidden conflict within. This is why classical philosophy had no need of a concept of will, and no need to determine the will as free. The Augustinian solitude of hot contention within the soul itself was utterly unknown, for the fight in which he had become engaged was not between reason and passion, between understanding and thumos, that is, between two different human faculties, but it was a conflict within the will itself. So let's contextualize Arendt's claim that classical antiquity was unaware of the will. If we consider Plato's model of the soul from the Phaedrus, then there is no place for this hot contention to occur. Logos, or reason, drives the chariot, but in Plato's terms it is absurd to suggest a conflict within reason. Thumos is the spirit, and maybe we could conceive of a conflict within the spirit, but Thumos is the white steed, who is supposed to be amenable to the charioteer's directives. Only left then is Eros, the dark horse, who is unruly and driven by the appetites. Arendt does not mention it at all, and you might think that this is an oversight. Could human indecision be explained by Plato as a conflict between Eros and then either Logos or Thumos? I don't think this can be the case though, because that would be to suggest that appetite could overcome reason, which all three of the Athenian heavyweights seem to reject. I didn't mention Aristotle, but his reflections on intemperance and incontinence still rely on some information that is accessible to the temperate and the continent. It is from this thought process that we can understand what Arendt means when she says that if freedom were nothing but a phenomenon of the will, then we would have to conclude that the ancients did not know freedom. She concludes here that the inner dialectic is required for thought to proceed, but can have exactly the opposite effect on the will, paralyzing it. Willing in solitude is always to will and not to will at the same time. She unpacks this further in an incredibly dense paragraph. The paralyzing effect that the will seems to have upon itself comes all the more surprisingly as its very essence obviously is to command and be obeyed. Hence it appears to be a monstrosity that man may command himself and not be obeyed, a monstrosity which can be explained only by the simultaneous presence of an I will and an I will not. This, however, is already an interpretation by Augustine. The historical fact is that the phenomenon of the will originally manifested itself in the experience of the what I would do, I do not. That there is such a thing as I will and cannot. What was unknown to antiquity was not that there is a possible I know but I will not, but that I will and I can are not the same. For the I will and I can was of course very familiar to the ancients. We need only remember how much Plato insisted that only those who knew how to rule themselves had the right to rule others and be freed from the obligation of obedience. And it is true that self-control has remained one of the specifically political virtues, if only because it is an outstanding phenomenon of virtuosity where I will and I can must be so well attuned that they practically coincide. The idea here, I think, is that the ancients did not see the possibility of a conflict between the I can and the I will, that the likes of Plato would have claimed that those who were able to master themselves were the only ones who really wanted to, and this alone would make his concept of a political class and the philosopher king more plausible in context, I suppose. Had they been aware of this conflict, then they would not have identified freedom as a function of the I will. Arendt justifies this in a footnote when speaking of the conflict between human faculties that the ancients did know. We find this conflict frequently in Euripides. Thus Medea, before murdering her children, says, "And I know what evils I am about to commit, but Thumos is stronger than my deliberations." The point of the matter is always that reason, knowledge, insight are too weak to withstand the onslaught of desire, and it may not be accidental that the conflict breaks out in the soul of women who are less under the influence of reasoning than men. I will come back to that last line momentarily. Arendt says that it is the Socratic perspective that passion can blind men's reason, but that reason must prevail once it has asserted itself. Thus, the Socratic Christian tradition regards virtue as a kind of knowledge which could be mastered, whereas we in the modern age would be highly sceptical of this conclusion, precisely because we have, since Augustine, been familiar with a will which is broken in itself. Addressing that final line about women, it is not, or at least not only, a factor of the chauvinism of the time. Arendt's position carries the tacit implication that, unlike Plato, she does not consider it necessarily true that reason stands rightly in authority over every other human faculty. In this way, it is possible at least to accept the assertion that women are less under the influence of men without any implication of inferiority on the former part. I dare say there's some nuance to be had in that discussion, though, to be had anon. The next line draws a conclusion which I'm not sure I follow, but it sounds good, right? Listen. In other words, willpower, and will to power are for us almost identical notions. The seat of power is to us the faculty of the will as known and experienced by man in his intercourse with himself. And for the sake of this willpower, we have emasculated not only our reasoning and cognitive faculties, but other more practical faculties as well. What she means by this, again, I think, is that the Christian merging of freedom with free will implies that only what we actually do can be called what we will, and so the will becomes the manifestation of freedom. And yet it is broken. This is the so-called emasculation of both reason and action that she refers to. To summarise as best I can, Arendt has so far explored the historical basis of the fusion between free will and political freedom. Augustine identified the hot contention of conflict within the will itself, but Plato insisted upon self-control as a prerequisite for political power, and this fusion embodies the takeover of the vita activa by the vita contemplativa. There is some plausibility in Plato's case. Self-control could appear to be an expression of virtuosity because it demonstrates an attunement within the self that permits the I will and the I can to come into a harmony. We shall see another answer to this towards the end of the section, but for now, Arendt suggests a different priority structure. I will is to have the impulse to act. I know is one's awareness of the field of possible action. And these two together constitute the ego. I can is to be able to take action, but what is willed and even known can be impeded both within and without by necessity. The necessity which prevents me from doing what I know and will may arise from the world, or from my own body, or from an insufficiency of talents, gifts, and qualities which are bestowed upon man by birth. All these factors, the psychological ones not excluded, condition the person from the outside as far as the I will and I know, that is the ego itself, are concerned. The power that meets these circumstances, that liberates willing and knowing from their bondage to necessity, is the I can. Only where the I will and I can coincide does freedom come to pass. Arendt is again talking in a Kantian tone here, and I think we will see necessity come up in another guise in part 4. But for our purposes here, it is some obstruction to the I will that is effective regardless of the I know, and we must also consider that it must be connected to the realm of labour and biological need that sits closest to the life process. The I can is the breaker of chains here, so to speak, the instigation of something against necessity, but neither will nor knowledge are involved for its activation. Arendt has a second argument to separate freedom from free will, and it involves looking back to the political revivals of the Renaissance, where there were two groups of political advocates, the political scientists like Hobbes, and those who wanted to look back before the era of Christianity's dominance of politics, represented by Montesquieu. On this occasion, Arendt actually seems to side against Hobbes, as he represents the same rational and Platonic system that embodied Christian politics, whereas Montesquieu was deeply aware of the inadequacy of the Christian and the philosopher's concept of freedom for political purposes. And he avoided this by distinguishing between philosophical freedom, which is merely an exercise of the will, and political freedom, which requires the ability to act. For Montesquieu, as for the ancients, it was obvious that an agent can no longer be called free when he lacked the capacity to do, whereby it is irrelevant whether this failure is caused by exterior or interior circumstances. Arendt expresses surprise that the Greeks never discovered the will, even though they understood the struggle to tame the soul, and she says that the faculty of self-control, so beloved of Plato, is so obviously a phenomenon of the will that this seems unbelievable. Why did we need Augustine to reveal the existence of this part of human inner life? Her answer is that the will was only discovered in its impotence, which we said above, which is something that the ancients were not ready to accept. In essence, philosophy had to fully explore the scope of human willpower before it could recognize its limitations. But Augustine's will has a haunting similarity to Greek solitude. For the will commands that there be a will. It commands not something else, but itself. Were the will entire, it would not even command itself to be, because it would already be. Arendt describes this as every will being, in fact, two wills vying for command over the mind, making the will simultaneously powerful and impotent, free and unfree. But Augustine still saw that the will contained great power from its ability to command the body. The mind commands the body, and the body obeys instantly. The mind commands itself, and is resisted. But the body is part of the world, and is not the self. The self is that inner space that Epictetus believed was the dwelling place of freedom. Augustine, on the contrary, saw that this is exactly where the will was defeated. Christian willpower was discovered as an organ of self-liberation, and immediately found wanting. In the deadly conflict with worldly desires and intentions from which willpower was supposed to liberate the self, the most willing seemed able to achieve was oppression. I will be candid, I don't think I fully understand the distinction that Arendt is making between the will and the self, and I'm not sure that she has fully articulated it, or she is assuming some philosophical knowledge that I don't have. The self was mentioned briefly in part 1, but now comes back again as a clearly separate entity to the will. To make my best guess, I will consider an Indian perspective on the self. Many Vedic philosophies to consider the Atman to be a reflection of Brahman as the universal self. This is not what Arendt is referring to, as this self, the Atman, is something that is the same in all humans and is free of ego. It is the egoistic self, which is the instantiated individual that we all colloquially call ourselves. It is called ahankara in some but not all schools of Indian philosophy. But the problem is that Arendt previously implied that the ego is a gestalt of the I will and the I know. So how can the I will be said to liberate the self of which it is a part? I will answer that shortly, speculatively, but regardless, this is the point at which the conflation of freedom and free will takes on its most pernicious aspect, where the will to power becomes a will to oppression, and, continuing to spit bars, Arendt says, I can only hint here at the fatal consequences for political theory of this equation of freedom with the human capacity to will. It was one of the causes why even today we almost automatically equate power with oppression, or at least with rule over others. The result of this is that the will, no matter what it achieves, is always in bondage to the self. I think here Arendt is simply accepting the conclusion that the I will is inevitably just a part of the egoistic self, ahankara. This explains the existence of the hot contention and also its distinction from the faculty of thought. What we usually understand by will and willpower has grown out of this conflict between a willing and a performing self, out of the Augustinian experience of an I will and cannot, which means that the I will, no matter what is willed, remains subject to the self, strikes back at it, spurs it on, incites it further, or is ruined by it. However far the will to power may reach out, and even if somebody possessed by it begins to conquer the whole world, the I will can never rid itself of the self. It always remains bound to it, and indeed under its bondage. This bondage to the self distinguishes the I will from the I think, which is also carried on between me and myself, but in whose dialogue the self is not the object of the activity of thought. Here at last we get a clear separation between the duality of the dialectic of thought and the divided nature of the will. The I will, in its hot contention, is concerned only with the self, whereas the I think, in its dialectic, is concerned with literally anything else. And from this separation, Arendt makes a strong political claim, which again is at best partially justified, about how the experience of the will's impotence drove some actors to lose sight of the true purpose of politics and the true form of freedom. Tyranny, the only form of government which arises directly out of the I will, owes its greedy cruelty to an egotism utterly absent from the utopian tyrannies of reason with which the philosophers wished to coerce men, and which they conceived on the model of the I think. For all his authoritarian tendencies, we can at least allow that Plato truly did not create the philosopher king out of a drive towards self-interested oppression. He wanted his tyranny to be a tyranny of reason, based upon the I think, although we should recall that when Arendt uses the word utopian, it carries the implicit meaning that such a result is unachievable in practice. The demon in this situation is always necessity. Whatever its cause, being trapped or overwhelmed or compelled is the fundamental cause of our conflict of the will. The discovery of the will came from our very experience of its impotence, and the natural next step, therefore, is overcoming. Despite referencing the will to power, Arendt doesn't mention Nietzsche directly, but what we saw in his will to power was the ability of man to use the strength of his will, or willpower, to overcome himself and act entirely as he determines. This is somewhat reflected in Arendt's count of action and natality. By unifying the I will and I can, the individual is able to create something entirely unique. Her claim that the will is forever in bondage to the self is also quite similar to Nietzsche's position that every truly held philosophy inevitably reflects the character of the philosopher and is never the result of simple pure reason. With that in mind, it becomes easier to see how Nietzsche's embracing of the will to power was somewhat reckless perhaps, and that Arendt's model, while it is certainly indebted to her ill-fated countrymen, demonstrates a greater subtlety and pluralism that would never have been produced by the hermit of Sils Maria. But Nietzsche didn't start it. The dominance of I will in political theory is a direct result of Augustine's insight, and in the subsequent association of political freedom with freedom of the will. Because of the philosophic shift from action to willpower, from freedom as a state of being manifest in action to the liberum arbitrium, the ideal of freedom ceased to be in virtuosity, in the sense we mentioned before, and became sovereignty, the ideal of a free will, independent from others and eventually prevailing against them. This is where Plato's case for self-control is finally rejected, because devaluing virtuosity in this way robs the self-controlled of their moral justification. Sovereignty requires a sovereign, whether one or many, without or within. Arendt understands why this has become the case in traditional philosophy, but she herself thinks that, under human conditions which are determined by the fact that not man but men live upon the earth, freedom and sovereignty are so little identical that they cannot even exist simultaneously. Sovereignty means submission to the will, both to the individual and general will of the state. This is the theory of sovereignty forwarded by Rousseau, who argued that power must be sovereign because a divided will would be inconceivable. Sovereignty, being nothing other than the exercise of the general will, can never be alienated from itself, and the sovereign cannot be represented by anyone but itself. Power may be delegated, but the will never can be. However, in reality, Rousseau's theory stands refuted for the simple reason that it is absurd for the will to bind itself for the future. All political business is and always has been transacted within an elaborate framework of ties and bonds for the future. Because politics must be grounded on promises, which are just such a binding of the will that sovereignty rejects, so the grounding of political power in sovereignty will always fail. The I can must not be subjected to the I will. Not only that, but politically, this identification of freedom with sovereignty is perhaps the most pernicious and dangerous consequence of the philosophical equation of freedom and free will, for it leads either to a denial of human freedom, namely, if it is realized that whatever men may be, they are never sovereign, or to the insight that the sovereign freedom of one man or a group or a body politic can be purchased only at the price of the freedom, the sovereignty of all others. And there may be some watching who are inclined towards that second possibility. To those people, I would say that this leads directly back to a Hobbesian state of nature, where this sovereign group of rulers, no matter how competent, would eventually fail to anticipate the uncertainties of the future, and their group would fall to some other power faction, and in the meantime, their lack of innovative potential would inevitably lead to a human world that is less complex at the end of their reign than it was at the start. And if you are cool with that, then we disagree, I guess. Arendt ends part 3, though, with this devastating ultimatum. Where men wish to be sovereign, they must submit to the oppression of the will, be this the individual will with which I force myself, or the general will of an organized group. If men wish to be free, it is precisely sovereignty they must renounce. And I would like to let that moment conclude my part 3, but I do have to add that as much as this is Arendt at her evocative best, this conclusion only works if you agree with the rest of her thought process on the nature of the will and the conflation of free will with freedom. And even if I was confident that I fully understood every nuance of this process, which I am not, I would still say that it is totally possible to disagree with her perspective here. However, and what I think is indisputable, is that the case she has built through it, throughout between past and future and on into the human condition, requires recognition, and although Arendt may get recognition in academic circles, in the more down-to-earth political sphere, she most certainly does not. Quite possibly because the questions she raises would be so uncomfortable to both the left and the right. So here's another little intermission. Originally I had a more extensive section on the Phaedrus, but I now have a complete video on this dialogue and the relevant section regarding the allegory of the chariot, in which we see the various aspects of the soul and their journey around heaven, which is Plato's broader allegory for the very meaning of life itself. As I said in that video, there are many Western commentators who either implicitly or explicitly take the Platonic model of the soul as their basis for ultimate reality, and, once again, I would strongly contest not its usefulness, but its uniqueness. For one thing, it is a simple matter to directly compare the allegory of the charioteer and the journey around heaven to the Buddhist Hindu wheel of Dharma, although the latter extends over vastly greater time spans, of course. The particulars may be different based on different cultural touchstones, but these myths of fundamentally cyclic processes, eluding access to that which is greatest, are all our attempts as humans to relate to something beyond the point of contradiction, something about which we may not speak. The Western tradition places emphasis upon the striving of the individual soul to reach the good, and its political manifestation eventually became the monotheistic God, the idealized individual. The Eastern traditions focus more on the natural procession of the wheel. Some Eastern traditions, such as Hinduism and Confucianism, similar to the Western models, developed an explicit political philosophy of trickle-down virtue, where the seniors act as example to the juniors, because it is easier for great things to meaningfully affect small things than vice versa. Other traditions, such as Buddhism and Taoism, are better suited to viewing the wheel in a more passive way, given any one human's relative insignificance, although even they have never been completely free of power politics. There is also the interesting case of Moism, one of the 100 schools of thought of the Chinese spring and autumn period. It is similar in many ways to Confucianism, but with several explicit departures. Most notably, the principle of universal love and shared mutual benefit. This makes proper, universal love a core principle which must be observed by the Son of Heaven every bit as much by the lowliest of his subjects if the state is truly to prosper. Although even here, it all rests on the assumption that the rulers know and act according to what is good for the polity, and it is the rulers, of course, who are considered the best judges of what is good. Sound familiar? In these perspectives, we see similar approaches to the transcendent, but we have been historically likely to ignore the similarities in favour of highlighting the differences. I wonder why. In this section, I also had in mind to mention Robert Pirsig's use of the name Phaedrus in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, but I now have a video on this too, which gets to the major points of Pirsig's Phaedrus critique of Plato in favour of the sophists and rhetoric. For Arendt's part, she extends a preemptive olive branch on behalf of Plato. Natality becomes action, containing an inherent disclosure of the agent's identity to the world, and specifically the social world of many people. Arendt here advocates for Plato's genuine desire to rid politics of the spectre of violence, even if he himself was unable to achieve this, and she re-expresses this ancient idea in terms of the complex mass society of the 20th century, and in a way that might be palatable to the fading mentality of the pre-industrial era. And this was no mean feat. Pirsig's Phaedrus seeks in quality the beautiful fusion of both rhetoric and dialectic, and he wanted it to be something like the Tao. But this fusion of rhetoric-dialectic, if it is truly like the Tao, will necessarily hover over a contradiction. This sidebar was intended to show how, in spite of Arendt's decision to mostly restrict herself to the Western tradition, these same issues have arisen across the world, and cultural differences have only concealed them, while political actors in every culture, obsessed with power, but claiming to act on behalf of reason, have prevented the whole of humanity from addressing some of these most fundamental problems. And on that note, it's time for the grand finale. Go. Arendt's conclusion to part 3 is built on her claim that the Christian tradition and the Socratic school of philosophy make it hard for us to see freedom as anything but an aspect of the will, and also the destructive implications of this conflation. To avoid this trap, then, we must go back to antiquity. Shocker. Although she assures us that this is not for the sake of erudition and not even because of the continuity of our tradition, but merely because a freedom experienced in the process of acting and nothing else has never again been articulated with the same classical clarity. This refers back to part 2 and the esteem given to politics when it actually seemed feasible that the philosophers and politicians would one day be able to solve the riddle of the human condition and create a truly ideal state. This does indeed give their work a certain elegance and simplicity that could lead us to believe they had a clearer idea of these matters than we do in the modern age. But this is an illusion. All they had was a simpler state and, frankly, a simpler understanding of nature. Arendt recognises this, of course, but some modern political actors fail to do so and advocate returning to simpler political models like those of Greece or Rome. This attempt, if successful, will be detrimental to human prosperity. This may lead some to label me as a progressive, but I reject the term progress because, at least linguistically, it contains the Marxian trap of believing that there is a destination to political development, although this is still better than the conservative insistence that politics is finished right now, or worse still, centuries ago. The key point to recognise is that all developing systems become more complex over time, at least as long as entropy will allow. We see this in the universe and in the natural history of the Earth. Thus, if you care about the human world and humanity, then, whether or not you call it progress, the course of increasing complexity seems to me to be the most natural one. Although this is not without its own pitfalls, as we shall see. The path to understanding action and freedom apart from the will is complicated by the Socratic domination of philosophy, and to take the more non-philosophic path of assessing the human stories seen in the wider humanities, art, drama, poetry and history and the like, is too vast a task for this essay, perhaps too vast a task period. Arendt gives herself an easy out, however, and declares that we can still distill the answer out of the simple fact that both the Greek and Latin language possess two verbs to designate what we uniformly call to act. The two Greek words are archein, to begin, to lead, and finally to rule, and pratein, to carry something through. The corresponding Latin verbs are agere, to set something in motion, and gerere, which is hard to translate and somehow means the enduring and supporting continuation of past acts, whose results are the res gestae, the deeds and events we call historical. This seems to be an alternative deconstruction of the words praxis and pragmata, which we have already seen in previous essays. In the case of the Greek, archein implies all the qualities of the free man, i.e. those who have conquered the necessities of life. This, in Arendt's view, is as close as the Greeks get to philosophical freedom, and it demonstrates the coincidence of freedom and the capacity to begin something new. Freedom is experienced in spontaneity. However, the pratein, the completion, required the free man to move among their peers. In Greek times, free men necessarily were rulers over a household and needed to enlist the help of other rulers to carry through any enterprise. As history continued and technology eventually enabled more humans to feasibly have conquered necessity, the scope and complexity of human life expanded. This is necessary for the expansion of human cultural richness, but in all times, and increasingly in our own, those who have most conquered necessity become the most certain and decide that they have some special right to rule as a shield to protect them from a deep fear of that very same complexity, a shield which ultimately becomes a prison. However, to be charitable to these individuals, the simple Greek interpretation was complicated by its interaction with the Roman take on these matters. Arendt says that in Latin, to be free and to begin are also interconnected, though in a different way. Roman freedom was a legacy bequeathed by the founders. This looks back again to what is authority, and the auctoritas of Rome depending on the augmentation of the foundation to form the res gestae of the Roman Republic. Thus, Roman historiography, therefore, essentially as political as Greek historiography, never was content with the mere narration of great deeds and events. Unlike Thucydides or Herodotus, the Roman historians always felt bound to the beginning of Roman history, because this beginning contained the authentic element of Roman freedom, and thus made their history political. The Romans had a measure of time ad urbe condita, which is from the founding of Rome itself. This is similar to AD or BE today. This, in combination with the Greek view of freedom in action, is still the basic assumption of all political power. But all of these justifications were never valid. They might be more so if we still measured time AUC today. But really, in the modern age, they are simply obfuscations of fear and insecurity in the service of an icon of contingency. The convergence of Greek and Roman ideas of freedom is the source of the exceptionalism which I now call monotheistic exceptionalism, seemingly just one more thing which the Catholic Church lifted from their Roman forebears and imposed onto their God, ironically making him less great in the process. However, such ideas never blossomed in antiquity because Socratic political thought disdained political freedom, and its later Christian incarnations led us to the tragic fusion of freedom with free will. It is ironic then that it's back in the work of Augustine, who raised the problem of will in the first place, that Arendt finds her model of political freedom, although she seems to conclude that even he was only partially aware of it. So, we're at the final furlong now, and I just want to pull back the curtain a little bit for a moment to set up my narrative conclusion. In my first reading of Between Past and Future, there's a margin note I made in this final section that reads, "This is a very grandiose sentence." Recently, while reading again, I wrote, "I don't think that anymore." Then, at the very end of the essay, I wrote, "Is she trying to give this an uplifting finish? I cannot quite see it this way." Except now I kinda can. It may be recency bias or the bias of reaching the end of this project, but I can honestly say that these last few pages felt like the climax to the entire book, in which Arendt says that given the traditional background in which we find ourselves, BPAFs 1 and 2, and given the various crises of modernity that we now face, that's BPAFs 5 through 8, what is the essential experience of a human being endowed with the ability to act? This is the only power that might be able to create a synthesis of past and future that will help us here in the present. Viewed in this way, what is authority is almost a prologue for what is freedom, in the same way that power is the precursor for energy. But now I am definitely getting way too carried away, so let's get back to Augustine. Arendt's case here is, as far as I can tell, based on a single chapter of Augustine's only political work, De Civitas Dei, Book 12, Chapter 20. I have read this chapter, but I acknowledge that I'm not placing it in the context of the full work, so please comment below if you have read it all, and give your own favourite chapters from the City of God. Augustine considers each life to be unique so that he can accept the idea that no soul, once saved, must ever return to the miseries of mortal existence, because otherwise what the hell are we even doing? But out of this process, Augustine finds reason to see that every human life represents a unique beginning in the world, and every pathway to salvation is likewise unique. Arendt takes from this the original appearance of freedom in the history of philosophy, and takes Augustine to mean that man does not possess freedom so much as he, or better his coming into the world, is equated with the appearance of freedom in the universe. Man is free because he is a beginning. Because he is a beginning, man can begin. To be human and to be free are one and the same. God created man in order to introduce into the world the faculty of beginning, freedom. We may see in this divine explanation the Eastern concept of the universe experiencing itself. Perhaps God can only make sense of his own freedom by creating man who is able to be the imperfect avatar of it within the universe. And perhaps God therefore expressly requires that every kind of life be lived. We can also see again the core concept of natality, the capacity to begin, and because he is a beginning, man can begin. Citation needed. Arendt does not miss the irony of Augustine being the source of freedom in this way, and she suggests an explanation. Augustine was a Roman as well as a Christian, and in this part of his work he formulated the central political experience of Roman antiquity, which was that freedom qua beginning became manifest in the act of foundation. But this is potentially huge. If Augustine was attempting to support the Roman concept of foundation, then, by liberating freedom into the universal human concept of natality, Arendt is trying to present a conception of politics that is free of the idea of foundation. Question mark? To facilitate this, and apparently out of nowhere, she continues. Yet I am convinced that this impression would considerably change if the sayings of Jesus of Nazareth were taken more seriously in their philosophic implications. I say out of nowhere, but really it's not that surprising that Jesus should come up in a discussion which includes Christianity. The surprise comes, though, because Jesus is rarely taken seriously as a philosopher because of his imprecise language. Spoiler alert, the Gospels provide an, at best, fragmented view of his position, but in fairness, I've not made it my business to read them exhaustively for this project. You know where the comments are, but I advise against theological essays in favour of something small and substantive. I wonder myself if Arendt is just using a colloquial understanding of Jesus as a narrative crutch and then cherry-picking the concepts from the Gospels that she wants to carry her case. Once again, here she is mirroring Hobbes and his tactic in part 3 of the Leviathan. Nonetheless, this is what she says. We find in these parts of the New Testament an extraordinary understanding of freedom, and particularly of the power inherent in human freedom. But the human capacity which corresponds to this power, which, in the words of the Gospel, is capable of removing mountains, is not will, but faith. The introduction of faith is also somewhat sudden, and it's used as a technical term without fully justifying it first. What does she mean by faith as an expression of freedom in the New Testament? And where do we see this extraordinary understanding of freedom? If it wasn't clear, I am a biblical layman here, but I came away disagreeing with the word extraordinary in the quote above. Nonetheless, I will try to work forward by expanding on the following quote. The work of faith, actually its product, is what the Gospels called miracles, a word with many meanings in the New Testament and difficult to understand. We can neglect the difficulties here and refer only to those passages where miracles are clearly not supernatural events, but only what all miracles, whether mundane or supernatural, always must be, namely, interruptions of some natural series of events, of some automatic process in whose context they constitute the wholly unexpected. So we can examine the Gospels for examples of humans, including Jesus himself, creating the wholly unexpected through their actions, purely in a mundane way. Naturally, one may argue that nothing is unexpected to God, which may be true, but that is why Arendt caveats this with "in whose context." God's foreknowledge, or lack thereof, is thus entirely irrelevant to the consideration of these events in human terms. This is not a Bible study, and I fully admit I have not been exhaustive in my research, but let me just give my top 5 examples of human freedom from the Gospels. At number 5, it's any time a disciple just ups and leaves their life behind to follow Jesus. Wonder what their families thought. Sometimes Jesus doesn't even let them say goodbye or bury a dead parent, which seems a little cult leadery to me, but hey, the disciples chose their path. Number 4, at Matthew 8-9, the townspeople just apropos of nothing asked Jesus to leave them alone and go away, and without reproach, apparently he does, although he does bitch about them later. Taking the number 3 spot, and it's John 2, Jesus in the temple against the money changers. It might be in character for Jesus if you already know his story, but this certainly would have been unexpected to anyone who witnessed it. Number 2, and it's the Good Samaritan, another classic. It is as unexpected that the injured man's countrymen should abandon him as it is that the Samaritan should show him mercy. And hitting the number 1 spot, it's Mark 2 and Luke 5. In the town of Capernaum, 4 dudes bring their paralyzed friend to be healed, but the house is so crowded and they can't get to Jesus, so they make a hole in the roof and lower the stretcher down in front of him. Fuck yes, guys. Fuck yes. Leave your own favourites in the comments. Remember, mundane examples only, please. But it can't all be YouTube-friendly lists. Like and subscribe. There are examples of freedom in Jesus' words too. The most notable to me is the Sermon on the Plain from Luke 6, where we see many of Jesus' exhortations to not act in ways that emotions would tend to lead us, especially guilt, fear, anger, and distrust. I said especially guilt, fear, anger, and distrust, evangelicals! This seems to be a lesser version of the Sermon on the Mount to some people, but I like it better because the latter is all about how blessed you will be if you act in this way, rather than simply letting the actions stand for themselves. But, and just to take the other side for a moment, I'm far less impressed with the parable of the sower in Luke 8, in which the seeds of the husbandman are compared to the message of God. Some fall on hard ground and are eaten by birds. In other words, Satan takes the message away. Some fall on the rocks and cannot root. That is, the message withers in the heart. Some fall among thorns and are choked by the weeds. They become distracted by the things of the world. And some fall upon good soil, and those grow to full maturity. Those are the ones who live in the world. So, the seeds are the message, the nutritional conditions are the world, and the earth and the rocks are the hearts of the people. Jesus was not the first to make this allegory. 400 years earlier, Plato makes basically the same comparison, again in the Phaedrus, when arguing against the written word. I include this example to show that even in the Gospels and the ministry of Jesus, we see a denial of the world and of human artifice. This is the hallmark of both the Socratic and Christian schools of thought. This comparison is not perfect, of course. A more nuanced discussion could be had if there were time, but as I said in my own video on the Phaedrus, if I were writing the parable of the sower, the soil would be the world, the mind of man would be the seed, and the message of God, or any other set of ideas for that matter, would be the nutrients and the moisture that we provide to the seed in situ. And my version would be flawed too in certain ways, of course, but there is one, to my mind, crippling flaw that my version would not have. Soil and rocks don't get to choose whether a seed that falls on them is actually able to grow. But in spite of my skepticism, I do not blame the writers of the Bible for flawed analogies. They were not God after all. And I do not claim that my substitution fares any better in the last analysis. We shall leave the biblical hermeneutics there and return to why Arendt considers these to be miracles. It is because all miracles, whether mundane or supernatural, always must be interruptions of some natural series of events, of some automatic process in whose context they constitute the wholly unexpected. Automatism is a destructive force for Arendt, leading only to ruin. It is also the other face of the necessity we discussed earlier, the inertia and compulsions of the universe, no matter what their source. In the discussion of biblical freedom above, I focused on the inertial forces of negative emotions of fear, anger, and disgust, but it would be just too simple to claim that only these negative emotions, or indeed only positive emotions, can be responsible for this cultural inertia. Many different factors can lead to humans ceasing to act. In this, Arendt is also reminiscent of Master Mo. In the treatise Against Fate, Mo is recorded as saying that the widespread belief in fate, whether among the lords above or the people below, leads to a certain kind of inertia that can never create great works, and, worse still, is explicitly to the benefit of cruel and tyrannical men who are best able to take advantage of this cultural apathy.
Those who hold that there is fate say, "Whomever superiors punish is undoubtedly fated to be punished. It is not that he is cruel and tyrannical, and therefore is punished. Whomever superiors reward is undoubtedly fated to be rewarded. It is not that he is worthy, and therefore is rewarded. And so, rulers are not ye, ministers are not loyal, fathers are not compassionate, sons are not filial, older brothers are not caring, and younger brothers are not respectful. The origins of inhuman theories and the ways of cruel and tyrannical men lie especially in strong adherence to these ideas."
Automatism is clear enough in the natural and cosmic processes that we witness, but that it can be also seen in the historical processes that are started by men. Automatism is inherent in all processes, no matter what their origin may be, which is why no single act and no single event can ever, once and for all, deliver and save a man or a nation or mankind. Let me just repeat that. No single act and no single event can ever, once and for all, save a man or a nation or mankind. Every act, no matter how beautiful, can potentially lead to an automatic process which begins the corruption of everything it stood for. Once man-made historical processes have become automatic, they are no less ruinous than the natural life process that drives our organism and which in its own terms, that is biologically, leads from being to non-being, from birth to death. The historical sciences know only too well such cases of petrified and hopelessly declining civilizations, where doom seems foreordained like a biological necessity. Here we see, in historical terms, the analogue of the energetic quandary of our species. As the arrow of time drives us inexorably towards entropy, actions can be taken to create pockets of order and raise up the edifice of human creativity that Arendt calls the world. But automatic processes, when new forms are not created or are actively suppressed in favour of an ossified tradition, will do for the world exactly what entropy will eventually do for the universe. However, what usually remains intact in the epochs of petrification and foreordained doom is the faculty of freedom itself, the sheer capacity to begin. Because the source of freedom remains present even when political life has become impotent to interrupt automatic processes, freedom can so easily be mistaken for an essentially non-political phenomenon. This last point is another piece of the puzzle as to why there is such an apparent hostility between conceptions of freedom and the political space. And, as much as I might wish to place the blame on the ossification of tradition forwarded by conservatives and the right wing, we saw above that this automatism can also be instigated by so-called liberals and progressives too. The reason for this is that while on the one hand, conservatives clearly want to place society into a cultural stasis which stunts originality and complexity, on the other hand, liberals and progressives also tend to claim that their ideas follow pure reason, typically either natural or social science. In both cases, they are still adhering to that most fundamental maxim of the Socratic school, that the vita contemplativa is politically superior and the vita activa is to be suppressed in every case. And it was this maxim which Arendt most wanted to challenge. One objection that I anticipate here is that Arendt herself is sort of crowbarring this case together in her dense philosophical style, where Occam's razor would indicate that politics and freedom are simply as incompatible as they seem to be. To answer this, we must recognise that automatic processes are not the default form of politics, and that in the early days of a nation there were always periods where political actors genuinely do act, and the vitality of the state is enhanced by the spontaneity of those who are guiding it. Yet no one would deny that their actions are political. It is only as systems become bigger and political actors feel beholden to the system that they start to allow it to determine, that is, to automate their decisions. To determine the essential difference between these two expressions of government, we return to miracles and a restatement of the reason that Arendt chose to enter into the field of the New Testament in the first place. Every act, seen from the perspective not of the agent but of the process in whose framework it occurs and whose automatism it interrupts, is a miracle. This is the sentence that I labelled as grandiose, and I made two mistakes in appraising it on first reading. First is that we are explicitly told not to think from the personal and vital perspective of the agent, but rather the sterile and abstract perspective of the process in whose framework it occurs and whose automatism it interrupts. The second thing I overlooked. See that hyphen? What comes after it? That is something which could not be expected. This returns us to the mundane form of miracle discussed above, which should also have been clear by the heavy use of inverted commas, I suppose. Religious believers might say that here, in doing this, Arendt is downgrading the idea of a miracle and also downgrading faith in order to capture it in a philosophical form. And yes, I think this is exactly what she's doing. But we could also see it as her attempt to decisively remove human freedom from the domination of the will and the need for a temporal foundation. In addition, the final clause there clearly identifies unexpectedness as a marker or indicator of natality. Natality is a word that rarely, if ever, appears in between past and future, but it is central to the human condition. Nonetheless, natality is very much a part of between past and future, the brute phenomenon of something new entering existence and the social space. And once again, it reiterates Arendt's commitment to action and rejection of automatism. It is in this context, then, that we must understand the rest of the paragraph. It is in the very nature of every new beginning that it breaks into the world as an infinite improbability. Our whole existence rests on a chain of miracles. This element of the miraculous present in all reality is why events, no matter how well anticipated, strike us with a shock of surprise once they have come to pass. The experience which tells us that events are miracles is neither arbitrary nor sophisticated. It is, on the contrary, most natural and indeed, in ordinary life, almost commonplace. Without this commonplace experience, the part assigned by religion to supernatural miracles would be well nigh incomprehensible. Arendt is essentially saying that every fact exists at the end of a chain of events, the probability of which, strictly speaking, is infinitesimally small, simply by virtue of all the other things that might have occurred instead. In a contemporary example, in Watchmen, this is the argument that convinces Dr. Manhattan of the value of human life, convinces him of the value of the human condition at the very moment where he is ready to give up on the frustratingly tangled web of human interactions. At the end of this paragraph, Arendt also makes a curious claim that this experience of miracles is a commonplace experience for human life, a claim which sounds stranger than it is. If her account is to be believed, then infinite improbabilities need to be accommodated at every single instant. The commonplace experience of recognizing events as miracles must therefore simply be the human narrative-forming faculty that makes this accommodation, and without this causal faculty, the claimed deep significance of supernatural miracles could not be contextualized at all. This is it! The big finish, which I first rejected, then kind of accepted as uplifting. First, I shall read the penultimate paragraph unabridged, and then a section from the final one. I chose the example of natural processes which are interrupted by the advent of some infinite improbability in order to illustrate that what we call real in ordinary experience has mostly come into existence through coincidences which are stranger than fiction. Of course, the example has its limitations and cannot be simply applied to the realm of human affairs. It would be sheer superstition to hope for miracles, for the infinitely improbable, in the context of automatic historical or political processes, although even this can never be completely excluded. History, though, in contradistinction to nature, is full of events. Here, the miracle of accident and infinite improbability occurs so frequently that it seems strange to speak of miracles at all. But the reason for this frequency is merely that historical processes are created and constantly interrupted by human initiative, by the initium man is, insofar as he is an acting being. Hence, it is not in the least superstitious, it is even a counsel of realism, to look for the unforeseeable and unpredictable, to be prepared for and expect miracles in the political realm. And the more heavily the scales are weighted in favour of disaster, the more miraculous will the deed done in freedom appear, for it is disaster, not salvation, which always happens automatically, and therefore always must appear to be irresistible. Mic drop! And, like I said, I am now better able to see the positive case that Arendt seems to be making at the end of this essay. However, that's not to say I'm wholly with her, nor that I fail to see potential weaknesses in her case. This paragraph acknowledges that the idea of miracles and the infinitely improbable is a humanly intractable phenomenon, and her subsequent move to distinguish historical from natural processes is a rhetorical case that rests on her definition of human as being capable of action, a definition which is not fully developed until the human condition. Moreover, and in spite of her searing prose, the claim that disaster is always the result of automatism, while it is a plausible one based on our observance of history, does not seem to be completely irrefutable. On the other hand, I think I would agree that what we might call salvation does seem to require the emergence of something unexpected in the face of an impending disaster of some kind, and the more impending the disaster, the more miraculous the salvation would appear. The final paragraph begins by simply restating the infinite improbability of the natural world, and the essay concludes with Arendt's thesis on why the human world is different. The decisive difference between the infinite improbabilities on which the reality of our earthly life rests and the miraculous character inherent in those events which establish historical reality is that, in the realm of human affairs, we know the author of the miracles. It is men who perform them, men who, because they have received the twofold gift of freedom and action, can establish a reality of their own. A reality of their own is a dangerous phrase, but let me first complete Arendt's optimistic reading. It is only by understanding that we can take action, by taking the Moist path of rejecting fatalism, that it becomes possible for any human to realize their vision at all. And this is what I take Arendt to mean by establishing a reality of our own. And that is how she concludes her depiction of what is freedom. There are, of course, several problems that may come up, the most obvious one being this idea of a reality of their own, having very uncomfortable implications in these days of post-truth politics. Even back then, Arendt had already published The Origins of Totalitarianism, which, as we saw in Truth and Politics, can take the idea of a self-made reality in the direction of something truly monstrous. How are we to distinguish then between the action of a genuine advocate of humanity and that of an opportunistic totalitarian demagogue? I believe Arendt's answer would refer back to BPAF 7 and the fundamental importance of truth in the political realm. However, if we think back to that essay, we will also remember how truth was at a serious disadvantage in the field of political rhetoric, and how factual truth was vulnerable to being completely expunged from history, so this may give us cold comfort. Worse still, the problems that she discussed in BPAF 5 regarding education have only worsened since she wrote, whether this be through the growing culture of disinformation or the declining of educational standards. And all of this is against the backdrop of a technological age which continues to change the world in ways that humans would struggle to adjust to even under the best of circumstances. And these are not the best of circumstances. So as much as I said that I can appreciate the intention for an uplifting finish, I also think that it is not difficult to see how she could be accused of some blue sky thinking here, at least in today's political context. There is also the issue of the scope of action for each individual. Arendt speaks as if action were equally accessible to every human to precisely the same extent, and while this may technically be true, the facts on the ground tell a rather different story. For all her exhortations, Arendt does seem to acknowledge that high-level political action will remain the domain of the few, with the many being subjected to the currents that they create. Potential for action does exist at every level against the flow of automatic history. However, in reality, freedom in action does not represent the same amount of liberation for every individual, and perhaps never can do. An additional point for me with my Taoist leanings is the way that the phrase against automatism is acting against the flow, a phrase which every Taoist might recoil from. But in the very nature of Taoism, similar to Aristotle's mean, there is the balance in all things, and at some point Yang must act to control and Yin must surrender to action. Or perhaps Yang penetrates Yin and is engulfed in the act of penetrating. Eh, Natalie? Either way, the spontaneity of action can be compared to the notion of wu wei, of doing without doing. I think it's time to wrap up now, but I want to make one more comment on something I have alluded to several times throughout the essay. It is through her suspicion of automation that we can see how, even though she is far from being a conservative and argues strongly against tradition, Arendt remains suspicious of the political left and liberalism, because the process of automation can be seen clearly in the government activity of regulation, the fixed specification of how things should be treated in a political sense. The automation of the bureaucracy. Now, regulation has many faces, and of course conservatism is also based upon obeying some cadre of rules. But trying to fit things into a pattern which we have reasoned out is the premise not only of religion, but also science, including social science. This is the problem that Arendt wishes us to confront, that it is when humanity acts according to automatic principles that it slides into disaster, because individual humans sacrifice their ability to act. And even the seemingly contradictory forms of religion and science are both based on the Socratic domination of the vita contemplativa. That is not to say that there is no wisdom in any of the cautionary tales, one might almost call them regulations, that are found in pre-modern ideas. It is, of course, nuanced, but I will finish on as grandiose a note as I can. The basic dichotomy of power between East and West is that where the Western God-King dictates according to his will, the Eastern Son of Heaven is presented to be embodying and propagating a natural order. However, these are not pure forms. There is still an aspect of the dictator in the latter and an aspect of inherent virtue in the former, and the reflections can be seen repeated all the way down, of course. What shines forth from beyond all the contradictions is the Tao, which has been deeply investigated in all places and in all times. And, for my purposes at least, the Western aspect of the Tao is religare, which ties back the highest to the lowest. We are not to blame for the fallibility of our senses in our responses to Fortuna, but whether the response is therefore to overcome or surrender, maybe we can stretch somehow closer to just touching the finger of God. Arendt's essays are her attempt to deal with the collapse of the historical tradition in the face of the modern world, and they show us clearly that the essence of the political is in the public space and our unique ability to make our life into our own virtuoso performance in that space. This raises questions about the conduct of those who would restrict the nature of the public space, of whom examples can be found on both the left and the right, although mostly the right. However, as to the question of what is freedom, I think we have said enough here. Thank you very much for watching, and bye for now.